back in that day, there weren't rock climbing routes here. And so this was all new ground. By the 1980s, Eddie had already published 2 guidebooks to the Kern River Canyon and other areas around here in the Kern River Valley. Then he spent years guiding and teaching others the ropes of rock climbing. Eddie retired from his day job as a public transit supervisor and commercial driver's license examiner in 2020. Patrick Paul, who is joining Eddie today, retired in 2017 after 21 years as an educator. During his 44 years as a rock climber, he also guided climbing and climbers and taught climbing classes. Both Patrick and Eddie are known for their first ascents, rock climbing ascents, on rocks like the Needles, Dome Rock, the Hermit, and the Trilogy, and many other places as well. Those are just a few of the ones that I could get them to name for me. And they also both were known as founding members of the Southern Sierra Climbers Association back in the day. Eddie's book, Rites of Passage, gives us, the reader, a glimpse of what it was like for these aficionados to climb on untouched granite all over the wild places of the Kern River watershed and other places as well. The stories in the book range from whimsical to philosophical. Some of the titles include A Pearl of Great Price, a requiem for Needles Lookout, and The Purveyor of Selflessness. So like the rock climbs, which almost always have very interesting names, the stories in the book also have very interesting titles. For fans of biography, the book is a veritable who's who of the pioneer rock climbers in the Kern River watershed. And the book also happens to include the museum's new president, John Newman, in a story about 1976 at the Needles, when John was the rescuer. The story is titled Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and it's become a bit of Southern Sierra folklore. So please welcome E.C. Joe and Patrick Paul, and E.C.'s wife Christy, and Patrick's wife Kelly.
Oh, there you are. You deserted me.
You got enough juice in that thing?
Probably. I should probably put it in anyway.
Yeah. I'll try not to trip over
I'm trying not to sleep on it right now. Wow. 1, 2, 3.
You guys hear me okay? All right. Thanks, everybody. So, even if you're not a climber or interested in climbing, hopefully this will be entertaining for you. You know, mountaineering is a kind of activity that, you know, we all who participated in it, we just like to get to the top so we can let the air blow through the holes in our head. So let me read off my script here. It's I'd rather print it and have a bigger font than having it in the book. But I have to thank Diana Sanderson and the Kern River Valley Historical Society, John Newman and Linda Adams and the Kernville community for having me here today, and all you guys that showed up. First, I have to warn you all that today's subject matter is about rock climbing, but I won't be explaining how we get the ropes up there or how we go to the, you know how to do that already. So don't fret if you aren't a climber. Like I said, these stories are less about climbing and more about the people and the adventures that they had in the wilderness here in the Kern River Valley. So I'm here to entertain you with experiences from my book this evening, The Rites of Passage, the Legacy of Adventure Climbing in the Sierra Nevada. And let's see here. So let me start off with this. So you might want to know how I came about to do this book. It's always an interesting thing, especially when you self-publish a book. When I started climbing in 1974, I read every book I could get my hands on about rock climbing. And my three favorite books were the narratives about climbing experience, The Games Climbers Play by Ken Wilson, The Vertical World of Yosemite and The High and Wild by Galen Rowell. Those are my all-time favorites. These books were inspirational to me because of the adventures, suspense, fear, and self-discovery of written words and photographs. As I gained my own climbing experience, I had my own stories to tell, which were shared over many a campfire. I know some of you guys were there too. However, I didn't start to document any of my climbing experiences until about 20 years ago. And I thought a book about stories like the ones that I read would be cool, probably about 10 years ago. I realized that a book about climbing experiences in the Southern Sierra couldn't be just mine. So I pitched the idea to those I thought might have a tale to tell. And for those 10 years, I kept getting, hey, great idea. But failed to get anybody to put their 2 cents in. And then the pandemic came. The lockdown, extended COVID, lead from my engrossing work wearing many hats for a public transit agency in the San Francisco Bay Area. Months passed, March, April, May, and I texted a coworker to ask, what kind of absence code are you going to put on your time card? And she told me, I'm not going back, I'm retiring. So immediately, I saw my future pass in my mind's eye. Public agencies can be great places to work, but are unapologetically guilty of resource abuse. I knew that if I returned to duty, that I would be assigned to my coworker's job with no compensation, nor any chance to officially hold a position as the head of the training department. And I said, oh, hell no, I'm retiring also. So besides all the unfinished and neglected projects at home that were spawned by the COVID lockout and many hours of work, I had a lot of time on my hands. The pandemic's nudge and my mortality created an urgency to get the book done. And to my surprise, I had several contributors on board also eager to make it happen. Most importantly, a collection of historical accounts about rock climbing in the Southern Sierra had never been published. Our story had not been told. The pandemic created some unique challenges for collaborating with others in person to do a book. Amazingly, phone calls, emails, text messages, snail mail, and interviews on a cell phone recording app were our only contact tools. We got the stories done. I have to give thanks to all these people that contributed their 2 cents to this book, and then some. So Linda Adams, Catherine Allison, Lee Allman, Ron Carson, David Hickey, Richard Leversey, Joe Metz, Dave Ost, Patrick Paul, Randy Powers, Christian Solomon, Randy Steele, Brandon Thau, and Todd Vogel. And a lot of you guys that might be here that gave me some support in the post-publishing. Thank you. Then I failed to get a publisher to pick up the book, since obviously it is a niche genre. Frustrated, I quickly decided to self-publish, where the job of formatting, publishing, and marketing would be up to me. So Rites of Passage, The Legacy of Adventure Climbing in the Sierra Nevada, is a work that was decades in the making. The book is a tribute to everyone who aspires to adventure in the wilderness, to those who participated in making our legacy. Ultimately, this book is dedicated to a good friend and climbing partner, Richard Leversey. He had such a contagious enthusiasm for climbing and for exploring the wilderness. He was the keystone of development of rock climbing in the Southern Sierra. Richard passed while I had been finishing this book. If anything, he wanted not only to share our adventures, but to hopefully inspire others to have their own. Growing up as a kid in the suburbs of Bakersfield, large doses of imaginative play had a role in developing that perspective of adventure. It was my parents who allowed me the freedom to find my path despite typical parental doubts about my judgment. In my parents' defense, I hold them inculpable for all the crazy stuff I had participated in as a kid that almost killed me in the process. Early on, I figured out that any endeavors that would substantiate their doubts were best not shared with them. Most parents would have never allowed their 16-year-old son to go on a 2-week backpack trip with 3 friends across the Sierra without adult supervision, but mine did. That's me and some school friends at Cottonwood Pass over on the Sierra. They must have had faith in my budding adolescent mountain sense. My mom dropped us off at the trailhead above Lone Pine and said, "Have fun," and drove off down the road in a cloud of dust. The dust cleared, and with that moment, we gained the freedom to wander and curate our own adventures. This set the stage for my exploratory rock climbing in the act of first ascents, which is defined climbing in the 1970s and 80s. The Southern Sierra had sat largely untouched by climbers until the early 1970s, and the documentation of established technical routes was rare. You have to understand that what we were mostly doing was a major contrast to what the majority of climbers do today, which is to consume climbs. Consuming climbs is basically repeating climbs described in detailed guidebooks. So I wanted to read an excerpt to you guys entitled "The Pearl of Great Price" from the book, and I chose this because I feel it captures the vibe of backcountry adventure. It wasn't long into my climbing experience that I learned the joy and excitement of seeking out the obscure. The southernmost end of the Sierra Nevada in the South Fork of the Kern River was suitable for such a quest, harboring a bounty of rock, climbing spots rarely visited by humans. Its arid climatic environment allowed me to stretch my climbing season into the autumn through the spring months when the snow in the high country made it impassable or just too cold. There's nothing like catching the warm rays of the sun on a crisp winter day. You know, the lizards were onto something, lazily basking in the sunny rocks, cooling off with an occasional set of seemingly effortless push-ups. Some compare Domeland to Joshua Tree National Park, or even Tuolumne Meadows in the Sage. Like those areas, the variety of climbing is intriguing. In contrast, Domeland is isolated, remote, factors making it potentially unforgiving. The areas within the adjacent Domeland wilderness offer only the most committed climbers an endless playground. Some of the earliest ascents date back to probably the 1950s. Church Dome and its adjacent area have become quite popular due to its easy access from the road nearby. Indeed, this is an exception to the rule. Typically, most of these pearls of great price are guided by long trudges into true wilderness, where one most seriously assess their risks. The risks were multiple. Where the hell are we? Will we find anything of note? Can we climb what we find? What if one of us gets injured? Or will we lose faith and flame out? Traveling there was not a big wall adventure in Yosemite or elsewhere. Instead, it was the antithesis. The rewards are significant to those who can put forth the effort to venture there. Steve Brower and I were no strangers to adversity. Being employed by the Department of Corrections, Steve supervised an inmate laundry and I managed the inmate canteen. It was a world unkind to boast our spirits. All it took was Steve, then a non-climber, to show interest in going climbing to create an escape catalyst from the angst of our jobs. Steve and I worked similar shifts, so we were able to sort our schedules simply enough. Since I was always keen on exploring new areas and rocks, especially with a willing partner, Steve's fate was unwittingly sealed before he even knew what fate awaited. Sometimes being clueless is a good thing. During the early trial run, I set the hook. We had run out of water on our new climb on Voodoo Dome at the Neasels. It was not intentional, but once in motion, the hook came out. We slogged our parched asses and gear over to the Witch Sorcerer Notch, where I told Steve, "Hold on, man, I'll be right back." I returned with a rusty hulk that was once a large can of Del Monte sliced point peaches and syrup that I had cached years before in the woods. Steve looked at the rusty can with his tattered bleach label and incredulously said, "We can't eat that." "Don't worry, it'll be just like new." As I pulled out my P-38 stealth customized GI can opener with a 3/32 swedged cable loop to secure it from vertical. What was that gold-tinged light that Vincent Vega was basking in reading from the inside Marcellus Wallace's suitcase? It had to have been an open can of sliced peaches. I peeled back that rusty lid to reveal a veritable pot of gold just like new. Relieved, Steve couldn't contain himself. "Those are the best sliced peaches I've ever had. You saved my life." Steve had been, metaphorically speaking, competent partners must be vigilant to protect each other from risk and danger without flinching. Earlier that same day, I had gotten myself into a ridiculous situation of an imminent ground fall while forging that new route on Voodoo Dome, having climbed circuitously above the first protection bowl with no alternative to reverse my moves. I had to continue to the next stance to place a bolt. I could easily do the math. A fall before or at the next stance equal to me crashing to the ground. I alerted Steve, who was belaying me on the ground. "If I pitch off, you need to hold onto the rope and run downhill." This statement later made for great campfire fodder later on, a memory to our synchronistic experience. We jokingly named the route, "Mama Told Me Not to Come." Hook, line, and sinker, Steve was ready for more in the Dome Land. The only available resources about Dome Land climbing at the time were random entries in climbing periodicals like Ascent, the American Alpine Club Journal, or a token of articles in magazine as off-belay or summit. And even then, we would have to be paying attention to in the absence of Google search. Amazingly, from these unusual, ambiguous descriptions, we were able to find and climb numerous gems and establish a few significant climbs on our own.
Getting the phone call.
Naturally, a reasonable benign magazine article, Climbing in the Domeland Wilderness, sparked my interest in a new route established on Columbia Dome by the authors Dick Richardson and his partner Andy Solo. Their adventure was magnetic because they had spent some serious time in the wilderness to establish this technically difficult route. Initial explorations to new territory typically produce a route that is the most natural line or the easiest to climb. However, this route did not fit the description. I was curious to see what was between the lines of the article. In the 1980s, access to Domeland was allowed into the area via a few four-wheel drive roads. Roads through a wilderness area were perhaps the result of the multi-agency jurisdiction and confusion between the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. In our case, that was a good thing, since later they extended the wilderness boundary. required some serious recalculation of wilderness travel logistics once they changed that border. Even so, we still had a few miles of schlepping our water, food, climbing, and bivouac gear as close to the dome as possible. We backpacked from around Trout Creek to the north of Columbia Dome, leaving Steve's truck behind. After taking advantage of the fresh water from Trout Creek, we meandered through the sparse pinyon pine and sage landscape to the south towards the dome. The journey was silent, save for our heavy breathing and rhythmic crunching of the granite soil at our feet. The pilgrimage of the backcountry climber can be full of doubts of the unknown. No guidebook, no beta, no Google, only a few cryptic and vague paragraphs. Near the dome, we ditched all but our essentials for climbing and made to our objective, a route called KRVHS Blues. With a name like that, what could go wrong? Through climbing's lengthy history, anyone establishing a route somehow took license to name the climb, to catalog it into the minds of the climbing community, guidebooks, or to define it from other rivaling creations. Traditionally, most used lame monk ears that merely depicted the route's position as the northwest face, etc. However, over time, choosing more playful names, a name of a popular song or state of mind, a play on words, or perhaps to describe a feature that particular climb, or something that represented a significant event during the ascent, were chosen for a name. As we were discovered, KRVHS Blues was fortunately not for the latter. Once at the dome's base, a long and prominent crack system elegantly stood out and matched our vague description. Finding out where the route went to get to the crack was difficult. I knew that the first ascent team had climbed up the face and placed bolts for protection, but damn if I could spot any. The bolt hangers were challenging to see while looking directly at the face because of their color, tarnished silver, blended in with the surrounding rock. Then I remembered to use a little trickery. Standing with my face next to the slab, I scanned with a lizard's eye view. Bingo, spotted one and another, like a little shark fins cutting the surface of the sea of stone. Wow, let's climb this thing. The initial face climbing was mid 510s, which is pretty difficult if you don't know the numbers, and the rock was a little friable, which is a little crumbly. Beyond that was a long, tricky, unprotected traverse on a quartz dike to a bolt belay anchor. Handholds on this section were scant. It required precise footwork on a slimy dike. Carefully I advanced by crossing one foot around the other, performing a bizarre ballet on the stone. Once at the belay, I could see the glorious track system on the next lead. It appeared to have no end. Steve had difficulty following the crumbling holes, as he tried to rely on his hands too much instead of his feet. During his self-inflicted frustration, adjusted several times that he had just pried off enough holes that the route probably went up a few grades in difficulty. Instead, Steve was able to pull up on each sling I had left in place. Once he grabbed the sling on the bolt above the dike, Steve was in flight. Without a sound, the bolt had sheared off. Steve, hardware, and the hanger had fell in a wild 30-foot wide arc from a position almost level with me to hanging directly below me. Steve's face expressed sheer terror, came to what we know today as the Hans Gruber Memorial Exit. Shaken but unscathed, Steve required lots of rope tension to get him up the blank slab to the belay. We were able to laugh about it afterwards, and like the rusty peach can, Steve had yet another souvenir to bring home. On a serious note, this was a grim reminder about the bad bolts that are out there, and that they could actually break, especially when they get a little older. While climbing the slab below had been punishing, the endless crack above became our absolution. The price of the entry was fierce, but now, past the threshold, we entered a world of unbelievable treasure. Now what lay before us were hundreds of feet of perfectly finger-to-hand size with cracks on near-perfect granite. There was absolutely no other climb like it in the Southern Sierra. After each pitch, I'd sit at each belay with a especially eating grin. Having enjoyed the climbing every move, leading I relished it even more as I expended nearly every piece of gear on my climbing rack. Our summit visit filled our minds with vistas of our future places to explore. And for moments in time, we were the masters of our universe. Steve and I swaggered our way back to our bivouac site, perhaps feeling as if we had won a pearl of great price, and maybe we had. The only thing for certain was that journey to that moment was priceless. Thanks. I'm going to, before we have questions, we'll have questions like at the end, I'm going to have Patrick come up and do his little piece. And thanks for listening in.
This is on.
Hot mic.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Patrick Paul, and I was lucky enough to have a few stories published in this book, and then Eddie invited me to come down here and tell you guys a little about myself and my climbing experiences, and in particular read to you a little bit about one of the stories. So I started climbing in 1976, and it all started out with this question: what's that stuff on the wall? At the time, I had just moved into a house that we bought in Long Beach, California, and prior to that, I had been a surfer for about 17 years, and the real estate guy that sold us the house lived right next door to. And one day, I was over at his house, sitting down in his little home office, and I saw this junk hanging from the wall, all this colorful gear and a pair of funny-looking shoes and a big coiled-up rope and all this stuff. And so I said, "Hey, what is that stuff?" And he said, "Oh, man, that's climbing gear. You want to go climbing?" And I kind of thought for a minute, and yeah, I guess I would. Yeah, I'll go climbing. Yeah, that sounds okay. So about 2 days later, on Friday, we took off in this guy Rick's car, and in the late evening, and we drove down to Joshua Tree, a place I'd never heard of before. And it seemed like we drove all night and through a myriad of dirt roads and out into the desert. We finally stopped somewhere, and we get out of the car and we just kind of sleep on the ground for a few hours, and then the sun finally comes up, and it turns out, we are sitting in front of, I can make this work now.
There it is.
Sorry about that. Try this again. Oh yeah, there it is. We were sitting in front of this thing. It's called the Pope's Hat. And so we had a little bite to eat, and got all this gear together, and then we ended up walking out and around that side over there, that right side, and we came to this little wall, and there was a bunch of cracks in that wall. It was about 40 or 50 feet high. And Rick got all this gear out, he showed me how to make a harness out of a piece of webbing. He started talking about the gear, showed me how to tie a figure-8 knot and tie into the harness, and he explained to me what he was going to do. And he put this rack of gear over his head and put his arm through it, and he started climbing that crack right over there. And he got a few feet up, he pulled this thing off of his gear sling, and he said, "This is a hex." And he started kind of leaning over and showing me how he was going to place this into the rock and everything. He was kind of struggling. And while he was climbing up there, he was actually kind of huffing and puffing and slipping and he was very awkward. And I had to think, oh man, this isn't going to be good, you know. So anyway, he showed me how he placed the hex, and he clipped this rope through the carabiner on the sling, and then he climbed up a few more feet, took another hex off of the rack, and he, once again, demonstrated how he was placing it and everything. And that was cool. And then, all of a sudden, he just goes, "Okay, I'm coming down." So he down climbs. He doesn't even take any tension on the rope or anything. He just down climbs back to me, and he says, "I can't do this." I'm thinking, what? I'm tired. I'm a little hungover. I don't feel good. I don't feel like doing this. And so he says, "You want to try it?"
Wow.
Okay. So I put the gear sling over my head, and I started climbing up this thing, and I was wearing at that time I was in construction, and I had just a pair of, construction boots on. And I started climbing up it, and it wasn't too bad. And kind of figured my way up, and I got up there probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 or 12 feet from the top, and I decided I was going to try and place a piece of equipment, because I was getting pretty high up there. And I pulled another nut off the rack and fumbled around and made a placement, clipped my rope through the carabiner, and I headed up to the top. And it's a good thing I didn't fall, because I'm positive my placement wouldn't have held. So I got up there, and Rick had told me, well, when you get to the top, just sit down, and he had showed me how to do a hip belay. Just sit down and do your hip belay and bring me up, and then we'll walk off the back side. So then I took all the slack out of the rope, and then Rick climbed up there. And he climbed up. Now, the previous time when he climbed, he looked like he was struggling. And then this time, when I'm bringing him up, he's just waltzing up this climb. And he gets to the top, and he sits down, and he goes, "That was pretty nice, that was pretty good." And I'm kind of thinking, is he messing with my head or what? So anyway, we walked off the back, and we went home. And then I didn't climb again for a year or so. I did a couple climbs. I had moved up to Oregon. I did a couple more climbs up there. So I had 3 climbs under my belt, I think, by the time I moved to this area in 1978. But the funny thing is that, well, when I started climbing, my life really became about doing first ascents because of the people I met in climbing in this area. And so years later, I kind of went back in my mind, and I wanted to figure out where this climb was that I started on. And I realized when I was researching this that my first climb wasn't recorded until 2007.
Wow.
and it was named My Three Friends, and it was rated 5.7. So apparently, the very first climb that I did was a first ascent.
Wow.
And I didn't know it. Anyway, if I can figure out how to move this thing.
There you go.
Yeah, too far. That was too far. There we go. So, I moved to Springville in 1978, and I told my sister who lived there that I had started rock climbing. Because I don't know why I told her that, but anyway, she said, oh, I know there's a climber in this town, in Springville. And so she introduced me to this guy, and we started climbing. We went and did a climb at Dome Rock. And then shortly after that, I met Richard Leversey. And Richard was 10 years younger than me, but he had a vast amount of climbing experience by then. And he really taught me how to climb. And I ended up moving in with Richard. His family had a cabin in Camp Nelson. I ended up moving in with him, and we climbed a lot together. And we used to go to Dome Rock, like sometimes many days in a row and climb and stuff. But I eventually climbed almost every route on Dome Rock, which I'll show you in the next slide. But Richard taught me how to make anchors, how to tie into anchors, how to make anchors, everything about climbing. Techniques, face climbing, crack climbing, everything I needed to know. He taught me how to drill holes, and in those days we were using hand drills. He taught me how to do that. And he was just a wonderful teacher and first real climbing partner. And then eventually Richard moved away from Camp Nelson to go to college. But in the meantime, one time Richard and I, we did a route in the Tule Canyon on this thing called the Sky Garden Wall, which he had named. And we put up a route there, which we eventually named the Silver Sword Route. But the day that we did that route, Richard had been in contact with a local reporter for the Tule River Times. And that guy followed us up there and took pictures of us and interviewed us and everything. And then when we started our climb, he just left. And one thing I didn't know is that he published that story about our climb. He published our phone number at Richard's cabin. So one day I'm in the cabin and I get a phone call, and it's this guy right here, Ron Carson. And just I'll mention this other fellow in the background. That's Greg Vernon right there, who was also one of my climbing partners for a long time. But Ron calls me up and he said, hey, I read this story in the Tule River Times about you climbing, and he says, oh, would you want to go climbing sometime with me? I'd like to go climbing. And I said, yeah. You want to go do a first ascent? And because I had some other climbs in mind on the Sky Garden Wall. And Ron says, yeah, I want to do that. And I found out later on he had no idea what that meant. and of course I barely did either with that meant. But, so anyway, Ron and I met up, and we ended up hiking up to the base of the Sky Garden Wall, and we picked out this line, and we climbed it. It was a short route, and Ron got the name. He called it Relentless. And we figured it was probably about, I don't know, 5'9", 5'10", but not great at difficulty. But Ron was my climbing partner for many years, and he finally got to the point. This guy, he's not a very big guy. He's strong as an ox, and he's tenacious as a bull. And he has put up some of the hardest routes around here. And but but he was the kind of person that he would work all day out in the oil fields. He was a welder. He's retired now. Not that he's gone. He's just retired. But he would work all day out in the oil fields, and then he would come home, and this is in the summertime, and he had a climbing wall that could rotate on a swing. And he would get on that wall and stay on that wall for as long as he could until he was so exhausted he would fall off. That's how he practiced for climbing. And he got to be so good that I couldn't keep up with him. And then another of my climbing partners, also that I met up at Dome Rock, this guy over here, some of you probably know him, Herb Lager. He and his wife Eve, I'm just looking at my show here, sorry. Start again. He and his wife Eve, and we climbed together extensively. That's a picture of Herb. It was taken by Ron on top of this thing called the Fin at Castle Rock Spires, and we had put up this route which we called Silver Lining, which is really a classic face climb in a wilderness area, and it's a beautiful route. So those were my main climbing partners, and this was where Dome Rock, probably many of you have seen Dome Rock. This is really where I learned to climb, and I eventually climbed. I think right now there are something like 68 routes on Dome Rock, and I've climbed about 56 of them or something like that. But what's notable for me, most notable for me about this is that one day Herb Lager and I, we were climbing over here. We were anchored right there, and with Greg Vernon. And our anchor, one of the pieces in the anchor pulled out, and we dropped about a foot, all three of us, like that. And it just scared the you-know-what out of us, because we thought we were done. And as a matter of fact, Greg Vernon, after we got our composure back, he finally said, I think I'm going to go. And he just propelled off. And then Herb and I were talking. I don't know who came up with the idea, but we decided to do a girdle traverse of Dome Rock. And we wrapped down, we went over here, we climbed up this route, and to the first belay, first anchor point. And then we just started traversing across Dome Rock at about the level of the top of all of the first pitches, all the first rope lengths to the anchor. We didn't add any new protection bolts. All we used was the gear we had on our racks and existing bolts as we came along. So there was a lot of kind of creative protection that was done on that. And it was a pretty unique thing that I'll never forget, just because when we were climbing across, sometimes we would be out as far as 50 or 60 feet from our last piece of protection, and always looking at the possibility if we fell off of this gigantic pendulum down, which Ron was made of this phrase called the big red smile. Yeah, I don't know if you did fall off and do a giant pendulum like that, it would leave this red streak. It was quite a visual, and we were risking the big red smile the whole time we were on this route. So it was a pretty fun and unique experience. And this is a route that Herb and I and Ron put up on Dome. It's called Welcome to Dome Rock. It's a very steep area of the rock and very small holes and stuff. And so this is the other area that I spent a lot of time climbing in, is out at the Needles. And this is one of my favorite climbing partners, my wife Kelly. we climbed together after we met extensively for about 4 years until we started having children. And then Kelly really kind of opted for more child care than climbing after that. And she was nice enough to let me continue to get out and climb all the time. I just threw this in. This is a picture of a route called the Howling out of the Needles. It's kind of on the backside of that tallest formation out there. And this was a day that Eddie Joe and I went out and just climbed. And he took a picture of me. So, and I don't have a lot of pictures of me climbing, so I thought I'd throw that in. And this is Parker Bluff. And one of the stories that I wrote and that was published in this book is about a climb on this rock, which the climb is was eventually whippersnapper. I don't think I did anything wrong.
I think you got the two mics too close together.
It's called Whippersnapper, and it follows this water streak up here. And I was talking with Eddie yesterday, and this was something that Herb, we talked, and Herb said, hey, I've got this route on Parker Bluff that I want to do. And so, let's go look at it. And what I didn't realize is that Eddie Joe had actually told Herb about this route, or talked to Herb about this route, quite a while before we ever went up there. So it's really Eddie Joe's concept, I guess. But and there was always this little bit of a, I don't know, rivalry between Herb and Eddie Joe, kind of a friendly rivalry, I guess. But I think Herb wanted to steal it from him, is what it was. But anyway, so we went up to Parker Bluff one day, Herb, myself, and this guy named Charlie Lai, and we kind of went along the base and found the route, and then it looked impossible to me. One of the interesting things about Parker Bluff is it's really aptly named. It's really thin climbing. All the climbing you do on Parker Bluff is either putting your feet and your hands into smears, little kind of shallow pockets in the rock, or on really tiny edges. There's not a lot of real big things to hang on to. So all the climbs up there are pretty challenging. And this one is going to be no different. We did the first pitch of it, and I really struggled on the first pitch. I had a hard time on it. And then we went away for a week, and then we came back to do the second pitch. And which reminds me, I was going to tell you this. And Eddie and I talked about this a couple times, and I've talked about it with other people, but a lot of times, if you're a rock climber, and you meet or are talking to people that don't know anything about climbing, and they find out you're a climber, oftentimes, two questions that they seem to ask most are, how do you get that rope up there? So I guess the assumption is that somehow we fasten a rope way above us, and then we tie into it, and then we use that to protect ourselves in time. It's hard to conceive of, right? And then another question that people ask a lot is, have you ever fallen? It's like, I think the assumption there is that if you're climbing and you fall, you're probably going to die. So they're thinking the only way you could live as a climber is if you never fall, But anyway, so then you end up explaining how you get the rope up there, how you prevent yourself from dying when you're climbing. And this story that I wrote about Whippersnapper is about a fall, really, a long fall. So I'm going to read to you just part of the story about that day. bulge on the main face, and in order to stay with the water street, it was necessary to move out left again and climb on the left side of the slight cleft in the face. Placing the first bolt for this pitch was not too bad. I returned after placing the first bolt on the second pitch, and Herb went out and put a bolt high up on the left side of the cleft, and then he came back in. And that was frequently, we would kind of do that leapfrog on a climb. If it was really hard, one of us would go up and place a bolt or two and then come down, and then the other would go up and place a couple of bolts and come down like that. And so, so Herb came back, and then I went out for bolt number, or let's see, and then he came back in. I went out for bolt number 3, slightly up and left on the cleft, where we could then begin to move back to the right. I felt like I should do more than my share, since I had been so wimpy on the first pitch, and offered to keep drilling. About 12 or 15 feet up and right from where I was perched, I could see what looked like a good foothold for drilling, for a drilling stance. So I could see this little kind of a divot out on the face that looked like I could put my foot in it. And it looked fairly deep, I was hoping anyway. I moved across on smears and small edges to the spot. Unfortunately, the good foothold had dematerialized into a crappy, downsloping smear. And I was now desperately far away from my last bolt and shaking. After a bit of discussion with Herb and Charlie, looking down at them, going, "Oh man, this isn't good," and I don't think I can climb back down there, who were almost directly below me, and it looked like, I think they were pretty nervous, because when I looked down at them, they seemed like they were kind of huddling together and not really wanting to look up at me. like, you don't want to watch this guy die. So I began to look for something else to stand on. I could see a possible foothold about 10 feet above my head. I told Herb that I would go up and try it. And he reminded me that I was already looking at a 30-foot fall from where I was. I rationalized that the climbing wasn't too bad, and that the foothold seemed pretty good for drilling, you know. So I began to climb on the smears and small pockets that characterize the upper pitches of Parker Bluff. When I got to the spot that would be my comfortable drilling stance, there was nothing there. Once again, I was trying to stand on a small, steeply sloping, crappy little nothing of a smear hole. I was going to die, and I knew it. And so the thing was, this smear was just for my right foot. There was a tiny little edge just for my right hand. And unfortunately, I'm left-handed. And but I had nothing to put my left foot on, and I had nothing over here to hang on to with my left hand. It was just blank. And I'm looking back down at this bolt, which now seems like it's about 870 feet farther down there. And it's like, what am I going to do now? So, and those, by that time, we had started using these Bosch Bulldog drills. They weigh about 8.5 pounds. Big battery-operated drill, and you put a drill bit in them, and the drill bit's about this long. And you would have a tag line on the back of you. The Bosch was hanging on a bolt hanger with a thing called like a Fifi hook, they called it. And so you could, when you wanted to pull the Bosch up, you could just start bringing up the line. You would kind of bring it up with one hand, bite down on it to keep it from going back, bring up some more, bite down, bring up more, bite down, do this. So if you're, 60 feet out from your Bosch, you're pulling up line for a long time, hanging on. So that's what I decided I would do, pull the Bosch up and see if I could drill. So I ended up pulling the Bosch, and, oh, this is the whippersnapper. This is the first pitch of it right here. Oh, this is great. Not too much stuff up here. So I decided I would try to drill. And so I started pulling it up, chomping down, pulling up, chomping down, pulling up, chomping down. I finally got the Bosch up to my hand. Raised it up like this, put it above my head, pulled the trigger, and went about that much, and all of a sudden, I'm off in space, and I could hear what sounds like a little 10-year-old girl screaming her brains out at a Psycho movie. But that's me. So, going, falling down. I'm headed straight for Herb and Charlie, and the only thing that's going to save them from me hitting them is that we get tension on that last bolt and it swings me around like this. So time stands still in a way, and I've got the Bosch drill out here, and I'm thinking, I wonder how long this is going to take. and then I got to keep this drill out here because I don't want this to end up in my leg, So I just go, yeah! I swing down and across the face, and I could hear this shattering, skidding across and everything. I finally come to a stop, and this is like, whoomp, like that, and I'm hanging upside down with this Bosch drill still sticking straight out, and all this gear draped over my face. And I can hear Charlie and Herb over there going, Patrick! And Herb had kind of a hoarse voice. I can hear, Patrick! Patrick! Are you okay? And Charlie's going, hey man, are you all right? Come on, speak to me, And I'm like, oh man, where am I? What do I know? And I finally figured out, okay, I'm upside down. I've still got, my arm is still straight out. And I get myself righted, and I bring the Bosch in, and I look down, and my whole arm, from the tip of my little finger to the tip of my elbow, is just hamburger.
Oh.
So that's what, that was my braking arm, I guess. Slowed me down. But anyways, I saw that, but I was on so much adrenaline at that point, you could have done anything to me, I wouldn't have felt it. But, so I got figured everything out again, where I was and who I was and where I was going, and swung back over to Herb and Charlie, gave them the Bosch back, got reoriented, and then I said, I better go up and drill and do it right this time. So I climbed back up to our high point, and I went back out to that first foot, which was about 10 or 12 feet away from that hole. And I put my foot in that little hold. I held on to a couple of little handholds, and I thought, this is really good. I can do this. And so then I pulled the Bosch up, and I drilled that another bolt, put that bolt in, and then I went back up a little bit higher and a little bit past where I had fallen off, and I found a stance, and I drilled another bolt, and then I said, okay, I think I'm good. And then I came down. And then Herb went back up, and he finished the last couple of bolts for that pitch. And then we all came off, and at the bottom, the main topic from that moment of fall on was my fall. That's all we talked about all the way down the trail back to the car. And then we got down, we were trying to think of, well, what are we going to name this thing? So different names came up. I think Herb thought of Welcome to Parker Bluff. He liked the name Welcome to. And I came up with whippersnapper, I think, and Charlie came up with something like nearer, my God, to thee. Yeah, the brown streak in your pants is worse than the brown streak on the rock, or names like that. But, so we couldn't figure out which one we were going to use, so we wrote them all down and put them into a cap and then held it up, and Charlie drew one out. It was whippersnapper. So that's how it got to be named. And then I went climbing with Eddie not long after that. And he took a picture of me. That fall really changed my life. So, are there any questions?
So any questions for either Eddie or Patrick?
I got two. First question, do people still drill into the rock, or is that kind of environmentally not looked upon anymore?
In some places, it is not allowed to use power drill, like Yosemite Valley. But yeah, primarily people now use power drills to place bolts.
So bolts are still used, usually when there's no cracks, and you use what they call a phase climb there. So the only way to protect it is to have a drill protection.
And the other question is, you said you named this whippersnapper. Is this just a name you use, or is that something that gets recorded somewhere so other people say, I'm going to do the whippersnapper, everybody makes up their own name, or what?
Yeah, that route and that name are recorded in a guidebook. And so that and almost all the routes in this, in the rock formations in this canyon and up through the needles are all named and recorded in
And
the
who does this guidebook? Where do you find it, and is it published, or what?
Yeah, different people have written guidebooks. Eddie and Richard did I think the first guidebook to the Kern Canyon, which was a nice little paperback, which actually it was kind of cool because they made the binding so that you could unscrew these 3 screws and take pages out of it and take the page with you that had the topography on it with you on a climb, you know, if you wanted to kind of be guided by the book, not have to carry the whole book with you.
That was published in 1983, but it's been out of print though. I digitized it, it's available like on a CD, and the museum store has copies of those. If you like climbing topos, there's no literary value in it other than that. It's a catalog of climbs done up to that point in time. There's a current needles guidebook that was done by Christian Solomon, and that's available now. And that doesn't cover as extensively as that old guidebook, but is mostly of the needles area and Dome Rock.
And then I contributed to a guidebook that was written by myself and a fellow named Greg Vernon and a woman named Sally Mosier. And we, actually Greg was careful to cover all of these areas. He covered Kern slabs and the needles and Dome Rock and Hermit Spire and this rock called climbers called Trilogy, which is above Camp Wilson. And
Sequoia Park.
And Sequoia Park. Yeah, actually there were 3 volumes.
Right. And those are out of print also, but you can find them online for like $200.
Yeah, they're collectible. Yeah.
Would one of you or both of you explain what a first descent is and what's the significance of that? Since you both were involved in a lot of those.
Yeah. A first ascent is ascending some route on a rock face or on a mountain for the first time. So, in other words, nobody else has ever climbed this route before. And you're climbing it for the first time, and you are placing protection bolts if they're needed in, like in blank spaces that are devoid of cracks, or setting up anchor points and actually devising a route which then you would catalog and or publish in a guidebook or report to the American Alpine Club.
So a good example of Patrick's talk, the very first climb he ever did with it, what's his name, Rich? The fellow who went over to Pope's Hat. He unwittingly did a first ascent, which somebody cataloged in a guidebook to having done it in 2007.
Yeah.
But he'd done it like decades earlier. So he actually did a first ascent, but it was not written down. We did a lot of that stuff too, especially like in Domelands. We figured nobody else can come out here, so we didn't, you know, I wrote a lot of stuff down obviously, but you know, it was not published. When Greg came out with his trilogy of books, I was like, well, we were out there like 7 or 8 years before we went out there, but you know, it's at least it's catalog. We had done a lot of stuff that they went out and said, yeah, we did the first ascent of those. We were already there.
Yeah. And then there were other first ascents that I did that they were never reported or cataloged or anything. And then sometimes people even went back later on and climbed them, and then like there's one at Chiquito Dome that I did with a guy named Bino Kotis. And so the grade of the climb was relatively easy for us, and so we didn't place many protection bolts, with what they would call run out, like long way between protection points. And so then years later, I get a message on Facebook from this guy, and he says, hey, did you and Bino Kotis put up a route on the left side of Chiquito Dome? And I responded, I said, yeah, we did. And we called it August 9th. And he says, I think I climbed your route and added some bolts to it. Because these two guys started climbing it, and they didn't even see our first bolt, which was way the heck up there. And so they actually placed a bolt there, and then they climbed a little farther up and then found our bolt. And they went, uh-oh, we're not doing a first ascent, we're climbing something that's been done before.
Which brings a point that's debated a lot in climbing circles is you don't add bolts to existing routes. You climb them as the first ascent party have done. Right. So if you don't feel safe taking that run out, you can go climb something else.
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of been a sort of historical thing for climbers to do, is just try to do it an experience similar. It can't be the same because a lot of us went out there and it was nothing, right? So, but experience is close to that first ascent. You know, how that went down, just try to experience that without adding other stuff.
Donnie, you had a question?
Yeah, could you explain the difficulty rating system, like the 5.14, something like that?
Okay, it's pretty complex, but so like there's like 2 different levels. So mountaineering is divided into classes. So like class 1 is walking, and the highest grade is grade 6, which is like where you actually are putting some anchor in the rock and they're using it for physical support, like putting like a ladder on it, right? It's artificial climbing, as we call it. But within those grades, you get to class 5 is divided into 5 point, it's a decimal rating, so 5.0 obviously is going to be fairly easy for probably anybody in this room. When you get higher up to where it's, say, like 5.8, it's going to be, you're going to exert some energy, you're going to have to watch where your feet are, and you're going to have a rope on when you're climbing 5th class climbing. Right? Below that, you don't really need a rope because it's walking. In class 2, class 3 is like scrambling. Class 4 is sort of the borderline. Class 5 have a rope on, and then it gets progressively harder. Mathematically, it was only up to 5.9, but obviously we found out there was a lot harder climbs, and it's open-ended. I think there's 517 now, right?
Yeah.
Which, that's unfathomable for anybody, actually, so, you know,
It's called the Yosemite decimal system, and so it ends at, grade ends at 5, and then the difficulty beyond 5 is, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3 up. And then, like the British have a different way of grading on, they might be hard, difficult, severe, very severe. And then the Australians have a different way of grading routes.
at least that's numerical.
Yeah.
The British thing's,
Impossible.
yeah, it's pretty ambiguous.
So who determines it's a 5.9, or who decides that?
Good question.
That's arbitrary, really, but say Eddie and I did a first ascent together, we would, our consensus for how difficult is this, right? What do you think? And I might think it was 510A or B, like 510 A, B, C, D would be, a little harder, 510, a little harder.
But obviously, that's based on the personal experience, so to sort of make a remark is you have to have some experience on climbing in general to know what a grade is,
Yeah.
to determine if it's 5.9. And a lot of times, a climb can be set at a particular grade merely for one move in that whole climb of 150 feet or 400 or whatever long. Or it could be for the whole sustained rope length of the climb. So it could be a lot of easier moves, but for a longer distance, it can equal the same as, one hard move. Does that make sense?
So it's whoever writes the guidebook gets to put the number in the
No,
guidebook?
whoever puts up the
The
first
first
ascent.
ascent party.
So that
The guidebook author needs to gather that information,
Yeah.
data from the ascensionist, hopefully, or go climb it himself and get everybody else mad if he misses the mark, but.
So the way you kind of start to figure out how difficult the climb is, and you're doing a first ascent and you're kind of going, well, this might be 510 or whatever, is, when you're climbing a lot, you don't always just do first ascents. You climb routes that have been climbed by other people, and you keep building your experience and your awareness of the difficulty, by climbing other routes that have been done by people and rated. So maybe I've climbed 10 5.7 routes before I did this one route, and then I go, well, this feels about like how low those 5.7s felt. So.
Now, a good example is like when we started climbing, all of us, we did the Mecca to Yosemite where the rating system was born, and we did a lot of the standard routes there to get a feel of what that is. Though you might go to Yosemite and then travel down to Joshua Tree National Monument, you can find that those same grades are way harder for the same numbers, so you have to get a feel. And every place the rock's different, and your experience on that particular medium might not be as good as you were in Yosemite. And so, we all did our internship to, find out how those ratings were. And one of the things I used to do, other than first ascents, it was actually sort of a coveted thing to me to go out and do second ascents, because there were other people doing routes. So to grab a second ascent was almost as good as a first, because the route's still not really altered, and so you get to actually help confirm the grade, verify the grade, and sort of get that similar experience. So that was pretty fun too, is that you keep your ear to the ground, find out what's happening, and go do a second ascent.
So to kind of summarize, if you put up a first ascent, you get to grade it, and you also get to name it, besides the fact that the first ascent is completely unmapped territory, and you don't even know if it's going to go, right?
Right.
And so anybody who comes along then after you knows that it is climbable, and if they've got a guidebook, then they have a map to a certain extent to help them do the climb. So first descents are a big deal,
Yeah.
and the ultimate satisfaction, I'm guessing.
There is a lot in that.
Yeah.
But like I explained, so there's consuming climbs and there's creating climbs, so we did a lot of creating and consuming, though most people today, other than a couple people in this room, you know, they just consume climbs these days, stuff that's already been established.
Well, and people starting, when we started climbing, there weren't that many established climbs. So
If you wanted to climb it, you had to
Yeah.
go do it.
that was a great opportunity for us, right?
And everybody else stepped back and I was standing out in front.
But now, most of these crags up this canyon and the Dome Rock and the Needles have been developed to a point that nobody's putting in new routes there anymore. And so primarily people are coming there now, they're just climbing established climbing routes.
Now, the Needles in particular is, if you guys didn't realize it or hadn't been out to look at it, that area in itself is world renowned for rock climbing and is known worldwide. And it's very popular for climbers from Europe to travel here and use Needles as a destination. It's that famous.
And that's all happened since the 1970s. So when I was at Needles Lookout in 1976 and first meeting Herman and Eve Laker, they were putting up some of the first routes. There had been a few routes on the Needles back then, but very few. And now you're saying it's world renowned, and are people still putting up first descents of the Needles?
No, I haven't heard of any. I mean, you know, obviously anything could be saturated, and so most of the main, what we call natural lines have been done, and there's a lot of crack climbs there and a few face climbs on particular formations, though I'm sure there's more things to do, but we really haven't seen that much activity, I don't think. And, you know, with our recent climate things with the fires and road closures and stuff, so they're sort of snubbing some of that activity too. Plus with, you might remark just how most people, like I said, are consuming climbing, so they're going there to consume climbing mostly. And with the advent of a lot more like climbing gyms, some of that kind of stuff that we used to do is actually sort of scary, which it is. All right, so people aren't as fast and loose as some of us that were just there. If we wanted to climb it, we had to go do it, right? So people are relying for somebody else to go forward and do those things.
Any other questions for Eddie and Patrick?
Thanks, guys.
There's still donuts back here.
And we also have books for sale. I have a copy here if you want